A calm, precise line formed. The room at MIT had gone quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows a failed experiment or a broken machine, but the kind that follows a moment no one had prepared for. The AI had finished its analysis, 9,000 recordings, months of processing. And the output sitting on that screen was not what anyone expected to find. It wasn't noise, it wasn't randomness, it was a system. Structured, layered, modular, and in ways that took several long seconds to fully absorb, deeply familiar. For decades, the working assumption in marine biology was relatively comfortable. Sperm whales used around 20 one-click patterns called codas, and those patterns were thought to function roughly like simple signals: presence, alarm, social contact. The scientific consensus treated whale communication as something interesting but bounded, a biological signaling system more analogous to a traffic light than a sentence. Researchers knew whales were intelligent. They knew whale communication was more sophisticated than most animal systems. But the idea that what was happening beneath the surface of the ocean constituted something genuinely close to language, in the structural, combinatorial, deeply cultural sense of that word, was not a position most scientists would have defended in print. Not yet. Not until the data said otherwise. The data said otherwise. This is not a story about one surprising result. It is a story about a field of science quietly confronting the possibility that it had been asking the wrong questions for most of its history, and that an AI trained on whale sounds had noticed something human researchers had not been equipped to see. The implications do not stop at marine biology. They press outward into philosophy, into law, into every assumption we carry about what it means to be a creature capable of language, and what that capacity actually reveals about the mind that holds it. The story begins, as many shifts in science do, with someone sitting with old data and feeling something was missing. David Gruber, a marine biologist affiliated with Harvard's Radcliffe Institute, had spent years studying ocean life and had encountered sperm whale click recordings the way many researchers did, as a known quantity. Intriguing, yes, but mapped. Understood, at least in outline. That sense of closure began to crack when he brought the recordings into a different kind of conversation. Shafi Goldwasser, a cryptographer at MIT, listened to the clicks and asked a question that landed harder than it seemed at the time. She said it sounded like Morse code. Then she asked whether anyone had tried using machine learning to decode it. That question unlocked something. Gruber connected with Michael Bronstein, an AI researcher with deep expertise in the large language model architecture that had powered tools like ChatGPT. And the conversation that followed eventually evolved into one of the most ambitious animal communication studies ever attempted. What became Project CETI, a collaboration spanning more than 15 universities and research institutions, set out to do something scientists had considered theoretically interesting but practically out of reach: build a dataset large and detailed enough to let artificial intelligence search for structure in whale communication without the limiting filter of human assumptions about what that structure should look like. The base of operations was chosen carefully. The island of Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean sits in waters frequented by multi-generational sperm whale families who return to the same region year after year. That consistency was critical. You cannot study cultural transmission in a species if your observation window is too narrow or your subjects are transient strangers. In Dominica, the researchers had continuity. They had families. They had individuals they could track, tag, and observe across extended periods. Shane Giro, a marine biologist who had studied these particular whale communities for years, helped anchor the fieldwork and provided contextual knowledge no database alone could have supplied. The instrumentation brought into the water was extraordinary. Hydrophone arrays captured sound across spatial and temporal dimensions. Biologger tags attached to individual whales carried 3 separate microphones alongside GPS receivers, depth sensors, and accelerometers. Every click was recorded not in isolation but in full context, meaning researchers knew who was speaking, how deep they were, what direction they were facing, how they were moving, and what the social configuration around them looked like in that precise moment. This was not passive recording. It was the construction of a synchronized behavioral and acoustic record with a resolution that previous generations of whale researchers simply did not have access to. When the AI processed those 9,000 recordings, the first thing it did was reveal the shape of the gap between what scientists thought they knew and what was actually there. The expected number of distinct codas was around 21. What the AI found was 156. That number alone was enough to reframe the question entirely, but the count of codas was not the most significant finding. It was what those codas contained and what they could do that changed the nature of the conversation. Each coda had 4 internal components: tempo, rhythm, ornamentation, rubato. These were not arbitrary variations on a simple theme. They were structured parameters that could be independently adjusted, combined, and layered in ways that multiplied expressive range far beyond what a fixed inventory of 21 signals could produce. The system was modular, and modularity is one of the defining structural properties of human language. It is what allows a finite set of basic units to generate a practically unlimited range of meaning. The researchers submitted the acoustic data to Gaspar Bacchus, a linguist at UC Berkeley specializing in phonetics. When Bacchus slowed the recordings and applied acoustic analysis, what emerged was not what anyone had predicted. The sperm whale click sequences contained vowel-like structures, not metaphorically similar to vowels, functionally, acoustically analogous to them. Bacchus stated publicly that where researchers had previously thought of whale communication as a kind of Morse code, the recordings showed the calls were more like very, very slow vowels. Vowels are not incidental to human language. They are the resonant elements that carry meaning across syllable boundaries and give speech its characteristic continuity. Finding their functional equivalent in a creature with entirely different anatomy, a different evolutionary history, and no shared linguistic ancestor with any primate was not a predicted outcome. It was a discovery that forced a serious question about what conditions cause complex communication systems to emerge at all. Dr. Daniela Roos at MIT, reviewing the full scope of the AI's findings, confirmed publicly that the results demonstrated far more complexity than the field had previously believed. Her statement was careful. She was not claiming whale language had been proven equivalent to human language. She was saying the system was structurally richer than anyone had credited, and that the AI had identified architecture demanding a serious re-examination of decades of prior assumptions. One MIT researcher, responding to the initial AI output, reportedly said, "This isn't supposed to be possible." The AI also detected what linguists call duality of patterning. This is the property by which meaningless units, individual clicks in this case, combine to create meaningful ones, and those meaningful units recombine to generate new meanings. It is considered one of the core structural features distinguishing human language from simpler animal communication systems. Its presence, or something functionally analogous to its presence, in sperm whale clicks is not a minor footnote. It is a structural marker of expressive capacity that science had, until recently, reserved almost exclusively for humans. Alongside this, the AI detected audience design. Sperm whales were not broadcasting identical signals regardless of context. Their click patterns varied in ways that corresponded to who was present in the social group, what the behavioral situation was, and what the apparent communicative purpose seemed to be. They were tailoring communication to their audience. That requires something closer to social awareness, a model of the listener, a recognition that different receivers in different situations warrant different signals. The phrase researchers use for that cognitive capacity is theory of mind. It is again a property that science has historically described as uniquely or predominantly human. And then there is the learning. Sperm whale calves are not born with their click patterns. They acquire them across the first year or more of life, through exposure to adult family members, through repetition, through what appears to be social reinforcement. If whale communication were purely instinctive, calves would produce adult typical patterns immediately. They do not. The vocal system is learned, which means it is culturally transmitted, which means it changes and drifts across generations the way human dialects do. The communication of a particular whale family is not just their biology. It is, in some meaningful sense, their culture. If you find yourself pausing on that, stay with it for a moment, because what follows deepens the picture further rather than resolving it. In August 2023, off the coast of Alaska, a team led by Dr. Brenda McCowan of Davis encountered a humpback whale carrying the research identifier Twain. What followed was described by the team as a 20-minute communicative exchange, conducted using playback technology to transmit humpback calls into the water and record the whale's responses. McCowan stated afterward that the team believed the encounter represented the first communicative exchange between humans and humpback whales conducted in the humpback whale's own language. Not a human-designed signal system, not behavioral conditioning, the whale's own acoustic language. 20 minutes, call and response, structured turn-taking, a wild animal in open water choosing to engage, reply, and continue the exchange across a duration that does not fit comfortably into the category of simple reflexive response. The first message interpreted from the AI's sperm whale analysis came from a coda pattern designated 1 + 1 + 3 in the dataset. The interpretation the research team arrived at was a statement of presence. The closest English approximation they offered was the phrase, "I am here." It is worth sitting with that, not because it proves fluency or establishes the full scope of what whale communication contains, but because of what it implies about the minimum baseline of what has been happening in the ocean all along. If the simplest interpretable unit of the system encodes identity and presence, the system is functioning as the kind of thing language functions as, a means of locating oneself in relation to another. The Galapagos observations add a layer that the laboratory findings alone cannot contain. Research teams tracking 25 sperm whales acoustically noticed something not fully documented before. When the hydrophones detected the presence of recording equipment, the whales went quiet. Not in a way that resembled a fright response, in a way that suggested awareness of the listening itself. Coordinated silence in response to perceived surveillance is not behavior you would expect from an animal operating on instinct alone. It implies a model of the external world, a sense that sounds being produced have an audience, and a capacity to choose on that basis to withhold them. The historical record adds a dimension that science alone cannot supply. On November 20th, 1820, a sperm whale struck the whaling ship Essex twice and sank it. 20 men were cast into open boats in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Anne Alexander followed in 1851, the Kathleen in 1902. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern. Beginning in 2020, orcas off the Iberian coast began targeting sailing vessels in coordinated ways. By 2024, more than 500 incidents had been recorded and 3 vessels had been capsized. The behavior spread through orca social groups in a pattern consistent with cultural transmission, younger animals learning the tactic from older ones. Historian Bathsheba DeMuth has observed that the whaling era may have left a mark not just on whale populations, but on whale behavior across generations. If whale communication is the culturally transmitted system the AI evidence suggests it is, the intergenerational persistence of knowledge about human threat is not a romantic projection. It is a structurally plausible consequence of exactly the system that has now been partially decoded. The science is honest about what remains unfinished. Project CETI has not produced a whale to English translation. The 156 codas have been mapped in structure, but not yet individually in meaning. The AI has revealed the architecture without yet being able to read full sentences. Full translation, if it ever becomes possible, will require years of additional work and may require conceptual frameworks that do not yet exist. But the nature of what is being translated has changed fundamentally. The system is real. Its organizational principles have been identified. And the first interpreted message points toward a communicative baseline that is not simple. The deeper question the science raises without resolving is what language actually is and what possessing it implies. For most of recorded intellectual history, the capacity for language has been treated as the clearest marker of a certain kind of inner life. The ability to construct and transmit meaning, to encode experience into shared structures, to build a communication system that outlasts the individual and persists across generations as culture, has been understood as something that says something profound about the creature that holds it. If that criterion is now not uniquely human, the implications press into territory science alone cannot adjudicate. They press into law, into ethics, into the question of what obligations one communicating entity owes to another. Legal scholars in multiple countries have already begun examining whether frameworks adjacent to personhood could apply to species demonstrating this level of cognitive and communicative complexity. That conversation will not stay theoretical indefinitely. The sperm whale's evolutionary path makes all of this more striking, not less. Cetaceans descended from land mammals that returned to the sea roughly 50 million years ago. They rebuilt their entire biology for aquatic life. And they developed, entirely independently of any primate lineage, a vocal communication system that an AI trained on human language architecture recognized as structurally analogous to the systems generating human speech. The word for this in evolutionary biology is convergent evolution. It has been documented in vision, in flight, in echolocation. Finding it now in the deep structural properties of language suggests that complex communication, modular and combinatorial and culturally transmitted, may be less an accident of human history and more a convergent outcome that sufficiently large, sufficiently social, sufficiently long-lived brains tend toward. That reframing is not subtle. It means the ocean has been holding something for tens of millions of years that we have only just developed the tools to begin reading. If the phrase "I am here," arriving from a non-human intelligence across that distance of time in biology, carries any weight for you, leave a comment with what you think it changes. The question of whether this finding is treated as a scientific curiosity or as the opening of an entirely different kind of relationship with the other minds sharing this planet is one researchers, lawmakers, and ordinary people are going to have to answer, and probably sooner than most expect. Project CETI continues. The recordings accumulate. The AI continues to process. Somewhere in the deep water off Dominica, a sperm whale calf is listening to its mother's clicks and learning carefully across the first year of its life how to speak. The ocean did not go quiet when we stopped listening. It was never quiet. The question now is not whether something is being said. The question is whether we are ready for what understanding the rest of it will require us to become.